My name's Declan O'Dempsey. I'm a barrister at Cloisters Chambers. Charities effectively have to ride two legal horses in relation to campaigning activities. First of all, in England and Wales, they have to satisfy the definition in Charities Act 2011, Section 1. So that means they have to be established for charitable purposes only, and they must be subject to the control of the High Court in the exercise of its jurisdiction with respect to charities. So these charitable purposes will include things like the advancement of education, religion, relief of poverty, and you'll see the charitable purposes set in sections 2 and 3 of the Charities Act 2011, which you can find if you follow the link that I've attached to this talk to the government website. So sections 2 and 3 define charitable purposes. These include also any purposes that may reasonably, that means objectively, be regarded as analogous to or within the spirit of any of the purposes set out expressly in the Act. In addition, all charitable purposes must be for the public benefit. Now, there used to be an assumption that matters such as education, religion, or the relief of poverty could be deemed to be of benefit to the public. That's gone, and you can't make that assumption anymore. You have to prove that this is the case. The effect of being a registered charity is simply to declare what the status of the charity is, and the objects, those are the aims set out in the charity's constitution, will be far more important. But essentially, for our purposes, it's important to remember that a charity's purposes must always be exclusively charitable. And political campaigning has been held to be not charitable, partly because the courts have difficulty in saying whether or not a change in the law would be for the public benefit or not. However, charities are entitled under charity law, at any rate, to undertake some political lobbying or campaigning, but only if the activity furthers the charity's aims or objects, and the activity isn't more than ancillary, so additional, not dominant, to its charitable purpose. The 2014 Act requires the details of anyone carrying on the business of a consultant lobbyist to be entered in a register. Now, the definition of consultant lobbying is wide, and the provisions can in some circumstances catch people who are engaged in lobbying for legal change on behalf of charities. Part 2 of the 2014 Act deals with non-party campaigning. This amends the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act of 2000 and limits the ability of charities to carry on lobbying activities during certain restricted times, which we'll come to, but they would include, for example, the period of an election. And under Section 85 of the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act, activities can be regarded as lobbying, even if they can also reasonably, that's objectively, be regarded as being intended to fulfill another purpose. Campaigns which are aimed at generating support for particular policies can also be lobbying. This is because there's no requirement for the activity to be aimed at a particular political candidate or party. The ability of charities to raise awareness of particular issues can be curtailed during the regulated periods if the expenditure of the charity exceeds the regulated amount. There is some Electoral Commission guidance on charities and campaigning. It outlines the rules on campaigning, taking into account charity law and electoral law. And it explains when a charity's campaigning can be regulated by the Electoral Commission, as well as by one or more of the charity regulators. So what about campaigning in the run-up to an election? It's useful to read the Electoral Commission's guidance for non-party campaigners. As a general rule, you'll be able to undertake campaigning and political activity, provided it's in the furtherance of your charitable purposes, and it will be permitted, subject to the terms of your governing documents. You mustn't, however, engage in any form of party political activity, and in any campaigning you must retain independence and political neutrality. This is important guidance. Under charity law, charities mustn't support or oppose a political party or candidate, but they can engage in campaigning and political activity which is aimed at securing or opposing any change in the law or policy of central government, local authorities or other public bodies, which is in support of their charitable purposes. Charity law allows you to express support for specific policies, even if it's advocated also by political parties, but only if it will contribute to the delivery of your charitable purposes. A charity is also entitled to campaign to mobilise public support on a particular issue or to influence or change public attitudes. In some circumstances, however, which are outlined in the Electoral Commission's guidance, spending on these sorts of campaigns may also be regulated by the Electoral Commission if it meets the requirements in the Political Parties and Referendums Act. So that leads to the question, suppose you had a viral Twitter campaign which was at no cost, or a cost which was substantially below the spending limit. Would that fall foul of the law? Let's see. So a charity is going to have to consider whether they're complying with charitable law requirements, but it also now needs to consider whether it needs to register as a non-party campaigner. And so you have to look at your planned activities, the timing of those activities, and how much money you plan to spend on them. If you use the pause button at this point, you can have a look at a flowchart provided by the Electoral Commission, which may help you to decide whether or not to register as a non-party campaigner. And essentially, you consider the spending that you're going to be engaged with. If you're not going to be spending money on campaigning, e.g. for the UK parliamentary election, then you won't have to register. If you will, then you need to have a look at whether you're producing electoral material, holding public rallies, public events, canvassing, engaging in market research, or those sorts of things that are aimed at or seen or heard by or involve the public. It'll include press conferences and media events, and transport with a view to obtaining publicity. So, if you're producing that sort of material and engaging in that sort of activity, can it reasonably be seen as intended to influence people's voting? If not, then you don't have to register. But if yes, then you have to ask whether you're going to be spending more than certain limits in a particular country. If you're not, and you're not planning on undertaking joint campaigning, then you won't have to register. But if you're going to undertake joint campaigning, then you may have to register. If you're going to be spending more than the spending limit, you will have to register as a non-party campaigner. So what is a non-party campaigner? Individuals or organisations that campaign in the run-up to elections, but who aren't standing as political parties or candidates. What is a regulated campaign activity? A campaign activity will be seen as regulated if it can reasonably be regarded as intended to influence voters to vote for or against political parties or categories of candidates, including political parties or categories of candidates who support or don't support particular policies or issues. So that's the purpose of the campaigning. So it would cover things like press conferences or other media events, or transport in connection with publicising the charities campaign. However, spending on the following is only regulated if the activities are, in addition to falling foul of the purpose test, being intended to influence, they are also aimed at, or seen or heard by or involve, the public. That's known as the public test. So this would include the production or publication of electoral material, canvassing and market research, including using phone banks, public rallies or public events. Looking more closely at the purpose test, spending on campaign activity during a regulated period is only regulated if the activity can reasonably be regarded as intended to influence voters to vote for or against one or more political parties or candidates that support or do not support or oppose particular policies or issues, or categories of candidates. For example, candidates who are in a certain age group. The campaign activity may offend the test even if it doesn't name a particular party or candidate. For example, if the campaigning for a policy is for a policy which is closely and publicly associated with one or more of the political parties. Under electoral law, even if campaign activity is intended to achieve something else, such as raising awareness of an issue, it can still offend the test, so that a charity can end up in the situation of being compliant with charitable law, but falling foul of this purpose test. A charity may undertake the activity under charity law so long as the reason for doing so is to contribute to the delivery of its own charitable purpose, and its independence and perceptions of its independence are not adversely affected. But the test under electoral law is whether the campaign is reasonably to be regarded as intended to influence voters. Turning next to more detail on the public test. Production or publication of electoral material, canvassing and market research, public rallies or other public events are only regulated if they also meet this test, which is as follows. Is the activity aimed at, seen or heard by, or involves the public, or a section of the public? And it's the latter point, a section of the public, that is likely to cause most difficulty. So the exceptions are members and committed supporters. Your organisation's official members or committed supporters, so the people who support your organisation in the same way as members, they won't be considered as part of the public. The exact nature of these committed supporters is going to vary between charities, but they could include regular donors by direct debit, those with an annual subscription, those who are actively involved in the charities. Generally, activities aimed exclusively at members or committed supporters won't offend the public test, and so they won't be considered as regulated campaign activity. On the other hand, people who you regularly communicate with, such as people who've signed up to a social network site or using Facebook, Twitter, etc., or who are on mailing lists that have been compiled for general commercial purposes and have signed up for email updates, well, these will be considered to be members of the public unless they're also members or committed supporters of the organisation. I referred earlier to the financial limits on spending. In England, the spend or planned spend must be no more than £20,000. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, planned spend of £10,000 must not be exceeded. This must be spent on regulated campaign activity, and it must be during a regulated period. So if you exceed those limits, the charity must register with the Electoral Commission as a non-party campaigner. The consequence of non-registration is that you can't spend more than £20,000 in England or £10,000 elsewhere on regulated campaign activity during that regulated period. And the trustees of the charity have to consider the Electoral Commission's guidance and also the Charity Commissioner's guidance and make an informed decision about the need to register with the Electoral Commission and keep a record of their decision. So what is the regulated period? The periods differ from a year for UK parliamentary general elections, so that's 365 days ending on the election day, but in all other elections the regulated period is 4 months. However, for this coming general election in 2015, the period was 17th of September 2014 to the 7th of May 2015. The spending limits. Registered non-party campaigners can spend no more than the following during that regulated period in UK parliamentary general elections. £319,800 in England, £55,400 in Scotland, £44,000 in Wales, £30,800 in Northern Ireland. However, the maximum amount a registered or unregistered non-party campaigner can spend on regulated campaign activity in a particular constituency is £9,700. If you've got a national campaign, the spending's got to be attributed equally to individual constituencies, and the amount you spread amongst the whole of the UK contributes to the spending limit for the particular constituency. That's the £9,750. So it's worth also looking at the Charity Commissioner's guidance on campaigning. Let's have a look now at the position on specific things which a charity might want to do. A registered non-party campaigner needs to record donations, and some of them must be reported to the Electoral Commission. There are rules about who the charity can accept donations from. They cover all donations given towards regulated campaign spending, even if they're received before the start of the regulated period or before registration as a non-party campaigner. However, money given over for general purposes rather than specifically to fund regulated campaigning is not considered this sort of donation. Charities and their trading subsidiaries are not entitled to make political donations or give any financial support or resources to political parties. In relation to electoral material, charities sometimes produce material that compares the positions of the parties or candidates, particularly when they support or oppose the aims or a policy relating to the charity's purposes. And if they do this, the charity has to make sure that the promotion of its aims is not confused with promotion of a political party or candidate, because the charity must not deliberately encourage support for any particular party or candidate. The test for whether material is regulated material is whether it's distributed to the public. Does it identify political parties or candidates who support or don't support the campaign's aims? Does it set out or compare the position of parties or candidates on a promoted policy? Can it reasonably be regarded as intended to influence voters to vote for or against particular parties or candidates? Does it promote or oppose policies which are so closely and publicly associated with a party or parties, or with categories of candidate, that it's reasonable to regard the campaign activity as intended to influence voters to vote for or against political parties or candidates? The rules don't generally cover lobbying or influencing of MPs, governments, or parliamentary lobbying, unless it involves the public in that activity, and the campaign can be seen as intended to influence the voter during a regulated period. Now, since the regulated period for general elections is a year, this means that the scope for campaigning in the year running up to a general election, assuming that we continue to have 5-year fixed-term parliaments, radically cuts down on the scope for charities to campaign on issues. But what if a charity simply engages with its committed members? For example, it sends them a colourful fact sheet which supports a policy of a particular party. Now, this document can, although the charity doesn't encourage this, be put in the window as a colourful campaign poster. The charity isn't engaging with the public, but some of its members may choose to do so. Will this be a regulated activity? There are also specific rules for joint campaigns. The combined spending may count towards the spending limits for each campaigner involved. The Electoral Commission gives guidance on the effect of being a lead campaigner, that's somebody who agrees to report the spending of minor campaigners, or a minor campaigner. One of the areas that charities may find most difficult is the area of hustings. In order to be non-regulated, they have to be non-selective. The guidance states that they may be regulated by the Electoral Commission if you selectively invite or don't invite only certain candidates or parties. So, hustings is going to be non-selective. In the case of local hustings, if you invite all the candidates known to be standing in the constituency. In the case of national hustings, you've invited all the parties campaigning in the election. It'll still be non-selective if you have impartial reasons for not inviting certain candidates or parties. Or the event will only be open to members of the organisation holding the event and is not made available to the public. Now, what constitutes impartial reasons for not inviting certain candidates or parties is as yet unclear. However, the guidance gives a good practice to be followed in this area. So if you can give impartial reasons why a particular candidate hasn't been invited or a party invited, this will help. Be prepared to explain your reasons to candidates or parties who are not invited. It's good practice to make sure that the candidates or parties invited represent a reasonable variety of view from different parts of the political spectrum. Candidates or parties' representatives attending should be given a fair chance to answer questions and, where appropriate, a reasonable opportunity to respond to points made against them by other candidates or party representatives. If certain people haven't been invited, you should inform the audience at the meeting of the candidates or parties who are standing and who have not been invited.